Hello everyone, today we talk about the Mongol contribution to the art of war and more specifically of their topping under the leadership of Genghis Khan and his successors of the 9 traditional principles of war, that is to say, mass, objective, offensive, surprise, economy of forces, movement, unity of command, security, and simplicity. We have made other videos in which we have showed how the art of war came to be in history. Through the Kriege, we have observed how war is really always the same, universally speaking, and that humans develop within its own boundary, right, applying it to various circumstances. The Mongols didn't quite invent any of these principles, but they have the record, the primate, essentially, of having developed the traditional principles of the art of war altogether, and in some cases also to a level that would have never been achieved until very recent in time. It's the case of movement, for example, that would have not seen the same efficacy, not even during the Napoleonic Wars, until fundamentally the German Blitzkrieg of the 20th century. And in this sense, the Mongols provide a historical unicum. As for other aspects that we'll see now that are definitely worth being credited in the annals of military history. So as we know, under the leadership of Genghis Khan and his successors, the Mongols created in a very short time the largest territorially contiguous empire in history, right? From the Danube to the Sea of Japan, from the Arctic Sea to Cambodia, 24 million square kilometers, right? That is almost a quarter of the emerged surface of the globe. And the reason for this success was, of course, primarily political, because Genghis Khan was primarily a political genius, right, capable of uniting the riotous and anarchoid Mongolian tribes under his command, right. However, as Clausewitzians, we know that war is an instrument of politics, right, and as such, the Mongols topped it in order to achieve this enormous result, right. It's important to distinguish also the political from the military dimension conceptually, because you realize that aside from the fact we don't know too much in detail about the single military contributions, for example, of Genghis Khan and also of other Mongolian leaders, that the way of war, I was saying before, was pretty much the same. What really matters is how effective the military instrument was and how the traditional principles of war were applied in this case, which naturally are not just a standard pack that comes along, I don't know, Mongol culture for that matter. Up to that point, the Mongols hadn't even been particularly threatening, at least by the scale that would have become later, right? And of course, it's on the same political and social basis. We'll see now that the Mongol Empire wouldn't quite last that long in perspective, but definitely leaving a legacy that surely had a dramatic impact also in the art of war of other countries. This is evident for China, for Europe. This summer I made a video specifically about the reasons of the Mongol success from the sources of Western European sources, and we have observed how, after all, the Mongols weren't doing anything revolutionary in of themselves, right? There was naturally a cultural shock as far as the more sedentary Western populations of Europe had not been acquainted with the type of steppes warfare that instead in Central and Eastern Europe were more known. So there is a very interesting historiographical, let's say, assessment we could make regarding that. But when you got down, in fact, to the individual things that the Mongols were using, like the Westerners were particularly interested in armor, horses, and it's obvious from essentially a feudal military perspective, like the one of the Western elite really was. But the greater achievement of any empire naturally stands in the moral forces necessary to build such a dominion, and having this dramatic, for example, projectional capacity that the Mongols had on the theaters of operations, as we'll see now. Their tribal mindset that surely conferred them that initial elan necessary to take over the world. But naturally there was a lot of civilizational work behind that as well, which of course increased also in the measure in which in fact the Mongols came to rule, as you know, on more developed peoples than them, that dramatically contributed to their exploit. In fact, just as skillfully Genghis Khan managed to include many of the subjugated peoples in his ranks, including them in his imperial project, and thus obviating the demographic limits of the Mongolian tribes themselves. This is also typical of any empire, as a matter of fact, but it's striking if you consider the fact that the Mongol Empire was still centered properly in Mongolia, so in an area that was not as advanced like the others, but that managed naturally shifting gradually their political centers in China, in Persia, in other areas of Central Asia, even, as you know, in Eastern Europe fundamentally, to rule over other peoples and to maintain also an important degree of connection with the original center. This is naturally more evident in the first generations, where still in fact the latter was the true heart of the Mongolian resources, moral and material alike, because that's the point. The military instrument was suited also for that kind of predatory from one side, as we'll see now, but also properly systematically subjugating mechanism that fueled the same, right, in the same Mongolian armies. And so the same political cohesion, right, and victory there was not really an option. And that's why there was a grand plan behind all this that naturally lies within the deep traditional universal imperial view of the world that Mongols themselves didn't quite express so directly from a historical point of view, especially again in first generations. Eventually they mostly adopted what that ideology was about, again in other areas of the world, in China, in Persia, etc., that definitely didn't lack that same ethos. But it's definitely complicated and quite difficult, to say the least, to pretend to enter the mindset of a late 12th or early 13th century Mongolian leader, or even just, Mongolian herdsman, and properly realizing, because that would be the only way, as a matter of fact, how and why would that system work so well the way that. Naturally there are many anecdotes, the one of Genghis Khan's mother showing her son, the value of strength, of political cohesion, breaking one arrow and saying, look at how easy it is, and then, picking a bundle and, right, not managing to do that, even though the individual arrows were still that weak. It's the same Roman fascist symbology, as you know. And so something that lays deeply at the root of the imperial cultures all over the world, that especially the most successful one, essentially a deep moral superiority. But we're not going to concentrate on this in this video. So the failures and the final division and decay of the Mongol Empire instead came due to the objective difficulty of managing centrifugal political dynamics of such enormous magnitude, right? As it happened the same way to the Diadochi, for example, after the quite fast Alexandrine conquest, and also to many other empires in history as well as that of the Mongols, right? We can't look at other empires and observing their dramatic resilience in a different way. You see Rome, or saying China, but you see there that there also was a gradual conquest, right? Time to assimilate, to co-opt, to sediment. What the Mongols achieved was imminently instead done so through violence, and therefore through a military instrument that needed that spearhead capacity to literally take over that fourth of the world that other empires instead had taken, yes, still through violence, but very often through much more mediated political negotiation over other peoples, and convince them to stay under. This is also the entire point of empires. Empires last until their formula is accepted by the subject. Doesn't matter whether these subjects are brought under or they are bought off or something else. Empires last because those who are under them accept that and essentially prefer that to other options, right? No power stands on itself, on the dictatorship of a single person. It's exclusively, purely, totally about the people in every single regime. There is not even a single regime on earth that lasted because the people were, opposed to it, but just somebody else wanted that. It doesn't not exist. It's always the people's responsibility and fault every single damn instant, even of centuries of domination. So that may be, in fact, quite civilizationally fruitful for that matter. And that's exactly what the point really is. So you understand that in the Mongolian case, well, being dominated by some wild, semi-nomadic people of the steppes is not really the top priority of, a refined Chinese aristocracy, or, the same goes for even a Persian one, or even other peoples that were rougher than the Mongols, but that were squeezed by them, wouldn't have that much of a broader benefit. The Mongols were pretty much aware of this, and this is exactly why instead they had previously succeeded. But they evidently lacked a broader civilizational structure capable of maintaining the cost of keeping this thing together on the longer run. Surely they changed the world, and the legends of their brutality are often misinterpretation of instead a quite sound political logic that, again, doesn't mean that the Mongols in that sense were not brutal, that their culture was not absolutely ferocious and vicious and incredibly violent, but that corresponded again to the necessities of an order that out there in the steppes and or other areas that, however, the steppes themselves are quite diverse within themselves, were necessary to keep things together. And so violence or threat of violence were essentially the only way these people had to accomplish their result. And equally central to the achievement of this result was the military art. That is the ability of Genghis Khan and then of his commanders and his successors to interpret and apply, by the way, the aforementioned principles of the art of war, which we will illustrate now along the way. So the military doctrine of the Mongols that we will delineate now respected, in fact, each of the traditional principles of the art of war with a particular harmony in the management of logistics, to which the Mongols paid definitely a special attention. I plan to make a video specifically about Mongol logistics to explain better, also with a specific campaign case, what it meant literally to move a Mongol army, because this is actually something I have to make about medieval armies in general, that contrarily to the hard to die stereotype of the alleged, in fact, roughness of the medieval military art, were radically sophisticated from and developed and advanced from a logistical point of view, right, and massively so. But in the Mongol case, it's literally the apotheosis of that, because this solution of logistical problems was not just the priority of a cavalry army, but of one that was capable of amassing hundreds of thousands of animals. Right? Remember, this was a steppe people, and most of their forces, we'll see now, in the same logistical base. Right? The entire idea, this man essentially lived on horseback, were nutritionally and broadly speaking materially satisfied by their animals that in turn were to graze on large, in fact, amounts of pasture that required constant movement, right? Because literally the passage of such forces drained the entire foraging potential in these areas quite quickly, right? And of course, at the center of this is also the sturdy, solid Mongolian horse. That was a little masterpiece of both nature and human selection, because it had a much greater endurance than what is already the dramatic one of an average horse, like say the war horses of Western Europe, and that allows, in fact, for this dramatic movements throughout terrifying grounds, some of the coldest and the hottest places in the world, at dramatic altitudes, and pretty much in every circumstance than you can imagine, crossing massive chains of mountains, deserts, etc. And naturally, the thing changed, as we were saying before, as also the Mongols were conquering other countries, and so they needed to mobilize just also with the means that were present in these ones, equine breeds included. But aside from the fact that, yes, these Mongolian horses were much less delicate than, say, the Western feudal ones, still they needed to be fed, right? And we're talking about hundreds of thousands of animals in the standard kind of major campaign army, right? The Mongolians undertook, on a regular basis every year. That latter aspect is crucial, but we will observe it later, especially. You had to feed these animals. A horse eats and drinks an astonishing amount of stuff in general every day, and requires also particular things. So you can't really feed him with literally everything. Also, the water has to be pure, right? So this, as we will see, brought with itself titanic logistical problems that the Mongols were, however, perfectly organized to solve. And consider that it's not just of course, the logistical problem that, contrarily to what is commonly thought, it has literally nothing to do with the art of war. Like, even a civilian can do that. The point was using these horses, of course, and with extreme success, as Mongol warfare showed in military operations. So a Mongolian army was a complex system aimed at war, right? They were a warlike people, and as such, they spent their life fighting in a way or another. Naturally, much differed from kind of the habitual seasonal raiding activities among the neighboring Mongolian tribes, and instead the mass transcontinental strategic operations waged to systematically subdue millions of people in the process, for which, of course, the armies to be mobilized were of radical, you know, organization, discipline, order. Also, as you understand, an increasing degree of professionalism. So much changes in the process, and nothing of that could have happened without, in fact, a concentrated effort. But still, these men were habituated to war, to violence, to consider people like animals, to slaughter, to retaliate, you know, to chop to pieces. This was kind of normal for the average Mongol tribesman that was constantly engaged, like as a normal semi-nomadic steppe warrior in any kind of this kind of, from smaller to larger scale warfare that entailed this also individual aptness to the most rough, ferocious thing. I mean, the same Genghis Khan at some point, as you know, was exiled, lived out there in the wilderness, eating carcasses, and so I mean, that's what they were habituated to do, right? That kind of lifestyle that you wouldn't even, and wouldn't even the, you know, Western Europeans at that time make them believe these were actual human beings, because they looked something definitely different from that, given their lifestyle and, you know, what this all translated itself in appearance. And we will see that in fact there were very different moral standards between, say, the average German, Polish knight of Legnica and even just, in fact, who opposed them in that battle from the other side, because they evaluated the same human life differently. Not that even Westerners or anybody in the world at that time kind of had a, you know, great respect towards human life, considering what at least we think it is today as a sort of, you know, equal thing. But definitely being raised in the Mongolian steppe wouldn't quite make you particularly close with the concept, to say the least. In any case, this allowed, as a, you know, tribal reality ensemble, to orient, in fact, the community in unison to the aim of systematic subjugation, right? It was extremely, and this is typical of the steppe, clear that political unity means survival. Because in the steppes, at the end of the day, there wasn't much of a broader difference. As we were saying before, also the areas from which Genghis Khan emerged previously hadn't really been even... those were the lesser Mongols, right? They weren't like the Karakhita. Those had been more successful against the Chinese, etc. They were just, as it often happens in history at some point, you know, a more primitive people that nobody ever thought was kind of much of a threat or capable of doing much. But in the case of the Mongols, it's probably the example of the greatest phenomenon in history. Like, there are other peoples like that, even the same, I don't know, there are many examples. The same Romans, right, who thought that the Italic peoples at some point would have, you know, merged in that sense, or even in colonial times, we think that the Dutch, you know, would emerge like one of the most successful Western European nations. Yet it's perhaps exactly that habit of, you know, living under constant threat or in a militarized context. Very often, you know, as you know, great nations emerge from prolonged warfare, right? So the Mongols were incredibly capable under the Khingidzes to fully exploit in the military field the virtues of this self-sufficient socio-economical system typical of all nomadic societies. The aforementioned thing of the horses before is something you find, if you want, again, at the steppes outskirts, even in Europe during the migration era. You realize that, you know, most, for example, even Germanic peoples were not just influenced by steppes cultures, but in that regard had their own clans, logistically self-sufficient, right? Which is, generally speaking, what organized communities tend to be, right? But this was done in a semi-nomadic sense, so literally abandoning a much more sound sedentarism like some of these peoples had in Central Europe before getting on the move, and adapting also to that kind of lifestyle. Whereas in the steppes, this was much more pronounced and just the standard since ever, right? At least ever since also the introduction of horsemanship had allowed, greater ranges to be spaced by individual groups, and or to gradually form these various lordships that were emerging with this dramatic projectional capacity. We never made a video about the Mongol army organization, but we will have to fill that Mongol warfare playlist. A standard basic campaign army, 2 men, of 10,000 warriors could have been followed perhaps by another 40,000 people, right? Other raiders who would join, field aides, other subject populations were in fact to contribute further to logistics, and at least 100,000 animals. According to some studies, even up to some 600,000. And the reason being, again, that in the steppes, these forces moved with literally all what they had sometimes, right? So they had to safeguard themselves through literally mobilizing their entire resources they could also keep exploiting and relocating, in fact, along the way. This operationally forced the army to move very slowly due to the need to let the animals graze, but not for too long either, as we'll see now. Albeit this affected the strategic situation in a practically relevant way, because no enemy could exploit such slowness, either for the precision and overall coordination of the military operations of the Mongols, and for the impenetrable screen set up around the armies by the explorers, or for their ability of the Mongol warriors to sudden accelerate, which burned the times and cancelled out the spaces. Right? Again, it's as if they had moved within an entire piece of country from which they could simply launch further attacks from, right? It's a bit like the same concept of a carrier, except it's an entire country that is moving, and it can launch offensives from wherever they are in that regard. Naturally, we're talking about a system that had formed itself within other, within the competition with peoples that essentially worked in the same way, right? So eventually the Mongols functionalized this military capacity in ever longer ranging and, in fact, far wider based supplies, also from, in fact, areas were not under their their cultural dominion, meaning that sedentary cultures that actually contributed rather to the Mongol effort from actually a more advanced standpoint, but with less of that habituation to continuous strains and warfare, just as a way of life. Consider it's also typical of steppes peoples, and we have seen it also in some videos where, for example, commenting on Magyar warfare in Europe after the Hungars had settled in the Danubian basin, launching raids all over practically the former Carolingian Empire, because of the intrinsic character of a nomadic army that is largely based on loot, just as properly a political, even before a military structure, right? You want essentially to have a core army that is able, yes, to even use siege engines and so on to take out fortresses, etc. But the main goal is to have always this kind of cosmos, this galaxy of hunting, raiding, in fact, looting and destroying parties that render extremely difficult for any enemy to approach the core of your own army, right? And naturally, in warfare, kind of you can have this greater moral superiority for which you're kind of more able to do this, if especially it's a system that replicates itself regularly, so that it reaches practically the equivalence of a professional one. But always remember that Steppes armies in this regard were often vulnerable to the same hand-to-hand fighting, say at a tactical level, and from a strategical point of view, in fact, of a direct confrontation of a say standard sedentary force. If this had not been properly worn out, but by all this couture of, in fact, skirmishers that harass the formation, the supply lines, and so on, right? And this is a conceptual point that we have made in various videos. If you check the Mongol warfare playlist, you'll see we have discussed it, because we generally think that these peoples had an edge, properly a military edge, as if this was unhinged from, in fact, their political one. In other words, as I was saying before, it doesn't really matter what kind of military system you use. Let's say if it is steppes, it's a kind of semi-nomadic in outlook or sedentary one. The important is how much energy you put in it, right? So when you look at steppes cultures, these are normally inferior compared to the sedentary ones. I mean, there is no doubt about this. It's the same reason why the Mongol Empire eventually dissolved the way it did. It kind of was absorbed itself. I mean, the ruling dynasties in more sedentary, civilized countries. But the core concept in this regard is that, in fact, this manifests itself with a sort of reluctance to join in hand-to-hand fighting. And within the art of war, this is a symptom of inferiority. So even if the Mongols, famously enough, managed to defeat repeatedly, essentially the best that the West, for example, could field at that time, initially, this is due to a broader moral superiority, not much because the military system developed per se was technically or tactically or even strategically more effective in theory than the one that the sedentary world was developing. It's a bit the same reason why Europe was not conquered, nor probably could be conquered, because it would have been a strategic and even a worse logistical nightmare for the Mongols, and not just for the obvious distance from the Kur-Altai across thousands of miles of steppes, but properly because that system was designed largely for taking over other types of systems. Naturally, strategical, say, geographical proximity helped dramatically the strategical side of the story. Say, look at China, that fundamentally neighbors Mongolia, and where you have essentially a frontier where at some point you don't even quite really distinguish who's Chinese from who's Mongol, even just in the forms of political and social organization that had become hybrid by that point. So these are bigger considerations that we can't leave for a more theoretical approach. Naturally, today we look instead at how the Mongols managed, paradoxically, in fact, to surpass this deficit exactly by injecting this enormous amount force that, incidentally, by developing the function, also maximized the traditional principles of the art of war. Right. So again, that's how we explain what would seem like a broader vulnerability. Let's say having this enormous amount of animals, for example, that forced you to take unavoidable strategic choices. I mean, if you don't have the pastures along the way to feed the horses, well, there are certain regions that simply you cannot even cross. So consider what this means also in terms of organizational capability and recognition of the ground on such large distances like the ones that the Mongols covered, right? They required an enormous intelligence net that they exploited dramatically, because they knew what the consequences would have been otherwise if they had not done so. And that awareness is the manifestation of that moral superiority. Not the fact that, say, nobody else would have those same problems strategically, or that they wouldn't understand the need of using certain means rather than not. It's how much effort you actually put in it that makes the thing. That's why von Clausewitz teaches that warfare is a matter of moral superiority, primarily. And it really is. And the Mongols are a great example of that. So this is how the military doctrine of the Mongols made the principles of the art of war its own, right? So starting from the first one, mass, as combat power and its concentration at the decisive time and place are crucial. The Mongols understood the importance of concentrating one's offensive power in time. This depended, as we've seen, on their politics. And considering they were a stateless people, at least initially, you understand that, the capacity of concentrating forces was based on essentially the agreement, the cohesion, that, again, bundle that we were talking about before. And space, well, they knew better than anyone else. They could project their armies at several thousands of kilometers, and repeating that in multiple directions every year. So I think we barely have an idea. Of course, these things are not documented in detail. We know how the thing happened, but what was the organizational background behind this? People that was fundamentally also illiterate, right? As you know, Genghis Khan also tried to standardize a certain script, etc. But as far as especially when they had conquered large chunks of the sedentary world, and they had to build unified communications, etc. But the Mongols did all this without reading nor writing. I mean, do you understand what it means? And when you think that you are kind of more you pretend, to make this childish mistake of considering yourself more intelligent or more capable than a person who lived 1,000 years ago. Remember that, if you don't have, I know people that if they don't have an iPhone, that they can't properly orient themselves in within a few kilometers of distance, and start whining about that, right? Just to make you understand how humanity is radically inferior compared to the one of millennia ago nowadays. And even the broader collective stately effort is no better. We're extremely weak in comparison. Which kind of country would be able to carry out what the Mongols in proportion, right? I know that the sense of comparison here is vague, but just to think to make a proportionate effort to do what the Mongols as a people did, right, as a political entity managed to do. Well, of course we are incapable even of conceiving that, right? And if you study Tengrism, if you study, generally speaking, the broader Mongol culture and mindset and religion, you realize that everything came with a completely different view of the world, and they managed to do that, by the way, we wouldn't even know where to start from. And this cooperation and coordination was evident throughout all the system. The Mongols, for example, showed great skill by concentrating the shooting of arrows at a single target from multiple sides and identifying the opponent against which to mass. This impressed the sedentaries because they were habituated to the steppes where the enemy can literally come from everywhere, and mobility is much greater in those tactical and strategic systems, for that matter. The Mongols used this tactic proficiently, as you know, in Europe by practically refusing their center, which again is a declaration of inferiority along that kind of hand-to-hand kind of heavy cavalry level. The steppes have very good elite cavalry, but it's very restricted in numbers. So the best thing they could do, of course, was refusing the center and enveloping the enemy on the flanks with, in fact, horse archers that were not were impossible to pursue by the Western Knights, not much because they were heavy cavalry, because they would actually do, right? There is an example of Crusaders actually chasing Seljuk horse archers. It's a myth that those individual knights couldn't do that, and also there are various stages in the development of, probably Western cavalry regarding the weight and so on. Simply they couldn't, because they would have kind of destroyed the formation in the process, meaning if you want to chase them all around, you have to go in 3 directions, and you have to split the unit. Instead, the Westerners, this was shown also at Nicopolis, Varna later on against the Ottomans, were importantly influenced also by Mongol warfare, charging straight, which was all but a mistake, right? Even though that was the enemy plan, it's because the enemy couldn't also afford to have any other. It's not now it's like a mouse in the cat's trap. No, it's literally that they didn't have enough force to stop that frontal charge, because that's what the Westerners were superior at. It's the broader coordination of the various arms that in the early 13th century Western European warfare was just kind of gradually compacting, and still mostly with less mobile elements, namely foot missile on the wings, that also probably did pose a problem to the same Mongol horse archers. In fact, on the long run, we know this happened also in the Caucasus, for example, in also in Cilicia and Armenia, telling the truth, so probably in the Near East. Later on, when Frankish crossbowmen were hired to fight the Mongols later on. I mean, the same Mongol warfare had kind of diluted alongside the pattern of sanitary one in the Middle East. But in that sense, yes, there was an important threat that any enemy posed to the Mongols. They never walked in saying, okay, we simply won. No, and that's the extraordinary thing that we don't want to understand today. It's not about having found a magic trick to defeat the enemy. It's about making an astonishing effort, spitting blood on a regular basis in order to achieve a result, which we have culturally, as a global community, completely de-habituated to think. Right? The entire purpose of people today is basically making no effort for nothing. Right? These people just knew that the only way, which is also a physical principle, that to achieve anything is to make an effort. And these were just more habituated to make one, and so that's why they could overcome their enemies, because they were just more habituated to carry out those combined arm tactics. They were just much more into that sense of action than, paradoxically, the more sedentarized and even gentrified Westerners weren't, even though we think of them today as, of course, compared to us, a dramatically, in fact, more militarized and active and violent culture, but they weren't compared to the Mongols. Again, what were the pros and cons? That still sedentary civilization was something that was structurally growing more consistent, whereas this steppes waves were somewhat doomed to remain that, because there was no chance that in the steppe a magic super state would have emerged just to keep those resources together. The system, entropically speaking, just collapses at a certain point under that pressure. But given that happy time moment of the Mongolian Akhmet, this was enough to wipe the hell out, for example, the same Western armies, as you know, that gradually, however, managed to counter the Mongols, to defeat them. This was true also for, think about the Mamluks in Egypt, in the Near East. So the Mongols began to dawn at a point, and so their warfare was somewhat laid out on other patterns that had modified in the meanwhile. And this is even if you just look at, for example, the warfare of the various Mongolian successor states. I mean, the Golden Horde is different from the Ilkhanate. Central Asian Mongols were kind of more faithful to their traditions. Even Timur the Lame was kind of that kind of Turkic Mongolian plus Persian melange. China had its own well advanced military culture on its own, continued on that pattern, but importantly influenced by the Mongols in the process. So again, I made lots of videos about this. You can check that out. Even the properly steps warfare playlist that makes you understand in a way how and why did the Kingizits emerge from, again, as I was saying before, an area that really nobody had considered more than much before those times. It is above all outside the battlefield, however, that the Mongols understood the importance of concentrating the masses in a coordinated way. They systematically marched apart to fight together. Getrennt marschieren, vereint schlagen. Centuries before Napoleon, and in fact von Moltke. And this, as you understand, had a lot to do with their logistical issues, because such large armies also necessarily couldn't be packed all together on a operational theater. They had somehow to come from different routes and to join forces only at a given place from different directions. And there was even, quoting Napoleon, a mathematical time to take before a unit of a given size that, as you know, in the Mongol armies was somewhat standardized. Even here we shouldn't exaggerate more than much. We're still talking about pre-industrial times. It wasn't that full standardized homogeneity as we think, but it was calculated by the Mongols in very concrete, practical, precise ways. That is to say, you have a given time before some units are worn out, right? It's just on Napoleonic battlefields, you knew you had a given amount of time. If you had a division there, a certain amount of hours before you knew that whichever enemy could have wiped out that unit. At the Battle of Wadi al-Khazandar in 1299, for example, the Mongolian commander Mahmud Ghazan withstood a full day against the Mamluks, giving his scattered army time for foraging to return in time to win the second day of the battle. In other words, at that point, you have to imagine they were probably freaking out from a logistical point of view. The horses had not grazed enough, they were exhausted, they couldn't form together, and simply the system would have not held otherwise. And so there was a force that was able to just contain the enemy on the first day of battle, also suffering losses of some significance, but knowing rationally, coldly, as much as the Mongols were able to simply decide to raze to the ground magnificences of world civilization such as Baghdad or Merv, and that to make that second chunk available in the first place to win the second day of the engagement, because there was no other way to win the thing. And so also entailing a sacrifice of a certain element. And so remember that effort, that willingness to say, okay, we have to pay a price if we want to achieve anything, and not just whining like bitches and little children because we have to pay taxes because there is a war, right? Every person that in war complained about paying taxes was defeated, right? For that matter, and then there is no much of a way that you can get around that. As for the second traditional principle of the art of war, the objective, right? General areas or points of strategic or tactical value, including enemy forces, the destruction of which is the ultimate goal of military operations. In other words, the Schwerpunkt. In this, the Mongols were naturally very flexible, so that they similarly anticipated operational doctrine by 6 centuries, literally the times of von Clausewitz. And their armies followed, in fact, a precise plan of operations by synchronizing the actions of the various groups in a chronometric way, right? The aforementioned example against the Mamluks is quite eloquent as well in terms of time, right? And this was carried out even though these armies were even hundreds of kilometers away. In this complex process, the Mongols never lost sight of the objective of the operations, always constituted by the main part of the enemy army, which concretely in strategy is what it gets down to, against which that they concentrated their forces lightning fast and unpredictable. Right? Remember also their projectional capacities had an important value within the range of some days of march, after which of course the army gets worn out. You have to reduce speed under a more sustainable pace, otherwise fatigue takes over and the entire thing falls apart anyway. But in those few days of march, they definitely could carry out exploits, especially with their fantastic mounts that, as we've seen, were incredibly resilient and thus appearing by surprise, as we will talk about surprise in a while, on the flanks of enemy armies, cutting their escape routes, supply lines, and so on. Other principle of the art of war is properly the offensive, that is, the use of initiative in combat by establishing time, place, strength, type, and direction of the attack. And this confers properly a momentum that, albeit consuming resources given amount of time, that's why attack is the weak form of war, but in fact with the positive aim, has to be withstood by an enemy. And as we've seen, these principles have to be combined also together to maximize their effect. So that's the entire point. And the Mongol armies always pursued with determination the objective of acquiring the tactical and strategic initiative, which they rarely granted to the adversary unless they were obliged to do so, because, in fact, losing the initiative is deleterious. And it does mean that you are actually the weaker side in that moment. So, in other words, the offensive was available to the Mongols also because they maintained those standards with the effort we have explained. And the enemy was thus also inevitably forced to react to the Mongol initiative, and equally inevitably obliged to do so under conditions of extreme disadvantage. Then surprise, right? The psychological weapon applied by reasonably unexpected action, which in warfare is, let's say, always an eventuality, and everybody knows that, yet within a range of possibilities that you have to assess according to the situation. And the Mongols based all their military plans on surprise. John from Plano Carpini, that we have discussed in the videos about the mendicant missions to the Far East, in which Mongol warfare was carefully observed, studied, and understood. That's how the mendicant orders contributed, among the other things, to the superiority of Western civilization, according to which, in fact, the Mongols fought more with fraud than force. Naturally, this was a Westerner's judgment based on the habits of, say, chivalric, or allegedly so, chivalric warfare, that, as we've seen, preferred frontal attacks, kind of the parity of the various knights, just with some primi inter pares as leaders, and so on. And this in part does reflect, however, as we were saying before, that same Mongol armies were not just properly designed to counter that type of tactics on equal ground, right? They compensated the way they were stronger, right? And every engagement was, outcome had to be determined time after time, in spite of the systemic superiority of the Mongol military in during the invasion of Europe that we made a video about. And of course, John from Plano Carpini was describing attack techniques such as ambushes and feint routes used by the Mongols to surprise the enemy, just as they did at the Battle of Lenitsa. But the most relevant surprise effect was the strategic operational one. That is truly what amazed the Westerners, linked to the speed with which the Mongols' armies appeared and disappeared, as we've seen. And that, again, was inconceivable for a Western army, because it was so bulky, and it was habituated to move within a world like, again, the European one, but more or less, population density, the level of political fragmentation, and the general coordination also that existed from within the system, interconnection, made every army movement kind of, first of all, normally destined to kind of a short range target, but also kind of, generally speaking, no, right? There wasn't much to hide there. That's also what, broadly speaking, contributed to the kind of also negotiations of chivalric warfare when they chose the ground and so on, because it was such a great effort, and it was so transversal that in order to settle political disputes, the military instrument was just adapted to those kind of standards. The Mongols, again, instead, were habituated to a world where, it's so vast, underpopulated, that you can move pretty much everywhere with the due logistical precautions that we have remembered before, and kind of just playing a lot properly with the intelligence system required in order to make that work. And just as we've seen, the strategical projection that steppes people could afford just by essentially moving the entire clan, the entire tribe, that in a sedentary world was impossible to do. So this was impressive, and naturally in the hierarchy of the art of war, this was more impacting strategically than tactically, because it literally bought an enormous amount of time, surprised the enemy on so many levels, whereas you can, yes, ambush somebody tactically, but at the end of the day, it's also how much you functionalize a direct attack, and that has to occur at least at bow range to make any significant difference. And still, it's based on hand-to-hand fighting at the end of the day, and so it's much more it's a much more predictable system, and that's why also strategy is much more complicated than tactics in the first place. So in other words, there is more a room of maneuvering within the broader strategic reality, which was also obviously dominated by politics. And the Mongols were kind of more habituated to do that compared to the Westerners, except, as you know, and as we have discussed also in that video about the Mongol invasion of Europe, probably the Mongols, and we don't have any evidence, sadly enough, of that, but it's likely true, right? They probably realized that especially Western Europe was too much of a nut to crack, especially for this essentially forest of castles that would have obliged this incredibly bulky system still of the Mongol armies to stop at every goddamn motte and bailey fortification, to essentially be exposed to the enemy attacks and definitely degrade much that logistical system that they so well mastered in that kind of movement warfare more than else. So it's kind of obvious that there would be a limit within that. It's not much of an operational or even strategic limit per se. It's probably a political one. How much would Europe that at that point was skyrocketing ever agree to be under a Mongol rule is something there to be quite assessed. There's a lot of irony also showed by in that moment of great threat indeed posed by the same Mongol invasions that reflect the kind of spirit also that the Westerners had in general at that point. So in many ways that's a non-problem. It has nothing to do with it rained in Europe so the Mongols couldn't use their boat. That's utter bullshit. It has literally nothing to do with nothing, because the Mongols fought successfully in some of the most humid weathers in Eurasia, and they perfectly knew how to keep their bowstrings dry. That has to do with massive political and strategic implications, and not just the fact that, of course, the Mongols were called back fundamentally by the to the Kurultai for the election of the Khan, before they could push forward in Western Europe. That also again would have been very complicated. Just at the gates of Germany, probably they realized that things were much more difficult than they had previously seen. But for this sparsely populated kind of Eastern European space, well, their effort had kind of been successful, right? And as you know, they managed to subjugate Russia and to even conquer it, of course, in winter and more. So there was nothing there that really scared them, also because they had frankly seen much worse in much other places. And one could, in this sense, use the same Mongol invasions as sort of political thermometer. Like look at what happened in the Middle East when they were able to take over some of the most urbanized areas and so on. But as we have explained in several videos, the Middle East was not Europe, specifically Western Europe, and just its broader decline of the Abbasid Caliphate, of the same Seljuk Sultanate that was essentially controlling it. But perhaps more, that also has to do, in a sense, with the instability brought by the same step at the outskirts of civilization. I mean, if you understand, of course, Mesopotamia was, a millenary civilization and so on, but the fact that it had been taken over by Persian culture and arms via the Seljuks, well, and that Persia is fundamentally a feudal world in between, again, the sedentary one and the steppes, already makes you understand that the Mongols could, penetrate those worlds with kind of greater ease than they could do crossing different layers properly of civilizational development, increasing, right, in quality, while pushing from Eastern to Western Europe, and that's quite of an important aspect to consider in the first place. But they tried. At least they were surely interested in Europe, and they wanted to see what they could do there, and they also kept succeeding. I mean, Poland was invaded thrice, just to make an example. but as you know, with ever lesser force, because in the meanwhile the Mongol Empire dissolved and was just, however, the Khanate of the Golden Horde that remained a power, as you know, in Eastern Europe for most of the late Middle Ages. In any case, other principle of the art of war, economy of forces, that is to say, the distribution of available forces in the most advantageous ways. It is a corollary of mass, in a sense, but it has to do with combined arms and how to employ them effectively. Like, the Mongols did not conceive war except for the purpose of victory. So to them, any action had to be carefully programmed, evaluated. They had so many countries under them that they were forced to just develop that intelligence and properly political awareness to realize what had to be sacrificed and what did not have to be, right? Even some of the greatest destructions that were brought by the first wave of Mongol conquest, that people say, well, because these peoples were kind of a bit more savages at the beginning, then they kind of understood civilization more. However, if you look at them from a political and strategic point of view, you realize they were pretty, reasonable in a sense. At least there was always room for. We don't know perfectly what the situation was to establish that, and certain actions are always debatable. For the if anything, the unpredictability that their moral consequences can have on different peoples, but it is true on a broader level that, of course, Mongol deterrence was used pretty intelligently and effectively, and also most of the massacres, the destructions, as sad as they could be for civilization. I mean, do you realize the Mongols destroyed Baghdad? Do you realize what Baghdad was before the Mongol destruction in the history of human civilization? Like, it's a disaster. But at the same time, it was functional to their broader goal, right? And you have to understand it, because what was Baghdad to them, right? The Mongols had a mindset revolved deeply around the say Central Asian steppes and China, roughly, right? That's mostly their kind of home and immediate area of projection. Already the Middle East, Mesopotamia, is kind of at the fringe of their, and it would remain, by the way, of their own world, because eventually, as you know, the Mamluks managed to stop them in Syria, and the same can be said to a certain degree even in Europe, right? So everything had a purpose, and the Mongols did not waste their forces on useless and costly operations, right? And all the other decisions depended on this, military-wise. The military organization built by Genghis Khan was entirely oriented to the elasticity of the use of forces, because again, they needed to adapt that quickly to the circumstances were within an incredibly complex system. So with significant advantages that, as we'll see, were in fact brought in the unity of command and in an efficient management of communications. They need to be constantly informed what was happening across these thousands of miles. The Mongol organic order, famously enough, was decimal. We've seen it before. At least virtually there were these 10 men, right, constituting an arban, 100 a yagun, 1,000 a mingan, and 10,000 a tumen. Plus, tumen constituted an ordu, or rather an army, from which also the term horde, in fact, derives. And we've seen how they could kind of separate the various chunks also to, in function of time, gradual use of reserves. Then there is movement. Now, we have already appreciated maneuvering forces in the execution of a battle plan. And no population internalized so completely and perfectly the importance of movement in war, at least until the Second World War and the Blitzkrieg of the German armored armies. So as you understand, in a very different context where also movement was not... okay, the Germans invaded Russia on muleback, literally, but still, the Blitzkrieg was based deeply on mechanized forces, doctrinally. So we can go as far as saying that, yes, like in kind of the pre-industrial reality, the Mongols stopped mobility in the history of warfare, and also by far compared to other peoples. Reconnaissance, espionage, diplomatic action too, right? Every mean was used to allow a dynamic management of military operations. In other words, the Mongols were masters in paving the way to deliver the quickest, most punching blow that their armies could afford, considering the already high, for other reasons that we listed, strategic projection capabilities. Another fundamental principle is the unity of command, right? So the certainty of command and concomitant capacity for delegation and teamwork. In other words, your forces must be always under a competent authority that knows what to do, why, when, and what's the broader logic connected to the master plan. So the Mongolian military system was quite effective also because it was meritocratic, right? It was much from the tribal and probably multicultural background of the Mongol forces that had been worked to draw the best from the various tribes, from the various subjugated peoples. In the invasion of Europe, for example, although the direct descendants of Genghis Khan were nominally in command of the three armies in which the operations were articulated, because this was a divine race of super people, and that's how they conceived themselves sacredly. The effective direction of the operations was in the expert hands of Subotai, who had no noble birth, but had demonstrated his skills since, at the age of 17, he had started accompanying Genghis Khan. And this was the first of the four so-called war dogs of the Mongolian leader, in fact, that are Yabe, Kubilai, and Yelme. So the fierce and faithful Mongolian mastiffs that were proud, naturally, to be so. This resembles, in a sense, the Napoleonic marshals. Martial system, if you understand how, of course, they had risen through the ranks in that kind of, in fact, meritocratic sense, because, of course, the Mongolian world was much less, socially segmented, at least in a formal sense, than what, for example, European nobility was beginning to be defined and closed. And naturally, the more you conquer and the more forces, especially the hungrier ones, are willing to serve under you. And so the more you keep that push, it's like with Romanization, right? The idea that Rome drew its enormous forces, not just by, of course, the, an ethnic pool, right, that did some of the most impressive things initially, but that kept kind of expanding because it provided other peoples with the opportunity of enjoying the same benefits of the conquerors, right? And this was mostly kind of course, nobiliarly made, but was still perceived in the ideal absolute tribal freedom of the individual that was considered as sacred. So naturally, as modern people, we always read these read nobility means the posh people that don't want to open anything. They're substantially different because society is rigidly separated. This does not exist in practice, and ancient peoples knew this much better because those who were capable were rewarded for the same fact that they had been capable and that were useful and could be used against those who weren't, and thus naturally keeping things quite balanced as well, because there was, of course, also an establishment to counter. But this happens in many ways in all great empires and civilizations. And speaking of Subotai especially, the authority and respect that the Mongols had for his intelligence and ability to command were incomprehensible, say, to Europeans, in fact, that were fascinated by other talents. Right, being more, again, egalitarian, they had maintained some kind of ideals, for example, of individualism, that were literal ideals, but still they were praised, and they were still pretty much in early 13th century warfare, kind of at the center a bit of warfare, like physical strength, courage, sense of honor, even beauty. I mean, physical beauty was deemed in Europe to be a moral value, and it's an important concept for a warrior culture, right? The Mongols had something like that as well, because every people has, but the level of, again, authority and control and discipline that had brought, in fact, the Mongols to succeed in their endeavors had properly identified a kind of higher view of, let's say, of leadership and moral leadership. Subotai would have had no heroic virtue in the eyes of a Western knight. He was, in fact, an obese old man who had to travel in a cart to be cared like a sick man, and would have hardly ever earned the respect of European knights, except, as you know, after the Battle of Ninians, the Mongols filled I don't know how many sacks of cut ears from the German and Polish knights that were massacred by the same Subotai. So, and better say, yes, it was conceived to be him, because that's what the empire descends from, to the commander down to the troops. And that is good enough proof of what it means to properly know how to make things work. And Europe was just emerging now, with some feudal monarchies taking shape gradually towards something more compact, more satellite, but just in a sort of infancy, right? So, as we were saying before, it was not even because the Mongols had anything more statue-like than the Europeans, but because they had this enormous elan deriving from the actions and the conditions that had allowed them to carry it out, right? And thus actually expressing a much greater collective effort than this individual polities in the far west of Eurasia. Other principle of the art of war is security. It is a system organized to prevent the risk of being surprised and to be caught unprepared in the first place, right? It has to do with efficiency and practice. And it was virtually impossible to surprise a Mongol army for the aforementioned reasons. The Mongol commanders took great care in gathering information on the enemy, with the massive and systematic use of explorers and spies along the entire range of the movement lines, while at the same time preventing the adversary from gaining information about their intentions and forces. They could do so because they also moved faster, because they were skilled in doing so, so they had developed the organ that regard. And because also they were at some point politically pervasive. I mean, they had such a deterrent force that it was kind of easy for them to find anyone to buy and to kind of pay the way for possible also, defections, and so on. But it's important properly from an operational point of view to consider the screen that existed around the Mongol armies, which has to do also with the grazing needs, right, of these forces. I mean, if you consider the aforementioned hundreds of thousands of horses, well, you have to have a massively large area that doesn't have to be left vulnerable from enemy attack. So even though the steppes naturally offers, almost without further regulation, this basically endless supply of looters that simply join the army because they hear you're moving. So you don't even need to command them. These are scum of the earth coming from everywhere just to loot and pillage, and etc. And as long as you will move, they will keep doing that all around. So spreading terror, etc. There was also properly an intelligence system that was based on messengers, in fact, on spies and patrols and so on, that had to guarantee that no enemy breakthrough could happen, so to catch the core of the Mongol army unprepared. This naturally, all this doesn't mean that the Mongols would do this in a standardized. I mean, they would be successful in every single instance. In these things. Well, these precautions were taken also by their enemies at large. It's just that they came to execute them in such a synergic way, given the push that they properly exerted in their expansion, that no other was kind of better organized, and so properly identified by that capacity of simply being up to those standards. This is something we can feel for in some parts of our history, when you realize that there are some countries that, for example, from a military point of view, were famous because they were allegedly more disciplined than others, because even in those cases they had to compensate for being, smaller countries that had to invest more in quality than others, and so on. So it's a bit like Prussia emerging with that kind of idea, and always eventually taking one step longer than they could afford, but still pushing also the boundaries of the art of war further. And as we've seen before, it's also what the Blitzkrieg derives from, and incidentally, that's the only time, the first time in history anybody had surpassed the Mongols in that movement capacity. The final, but not least important of the principles of the art of war is simplicity. That is arguably also one of the most difficult to attain, paradoxically, because simplicity is simple, in fact, but it's not easy, and this is what it's often forgotten. War, really, but this is what von Clausewitz says, is actually simple, right? Simplicity in this sense is doctrinally meant, right? It doesn't mean that war is simple because it's a simple system. Reality is not a simple system. Even if you take kind of a single person, you can imagine in this sense, what an entire army can account for. But I mean, keeping it simple, right, against the second principle of thermodynamics, where you're told that everything is practically falling apart, is the deal, right? And that's why it's so difficult to attain. And simplicity in this regard is exactly the litmus test of every battle plan. in every military operation, which facilitates the understanding and execution of orders, but properly concentrates forces, allows for the mass principle, basically all the other principles as we've seen, the unity of command, etc. So the training for large units of the Mongolian armies favored the application of repetitive and adaptable tactical schemes to any situation. It goes without saying that the more you develop an army and the more it adapts already by itself to the circumstances, like we don't remember, even within the same Mongol world, much of a proper military reform, because these armies were just, as we've seen, were just peoples on the move by themselves. So they would just develop along that pattern by themselves. And in sedentary populations, we can see reforms as, let's say, some stages of development, but they're really gradual processes, right? And a great deal of simplicity revolves around standardization, homogenization, rationalizations, and all this normally comes with professionalism, with a repeated use of the forces. That's why I'd say the Roman tactical segmentation of the Polybian army disappeared gradually with the formal sanction eventually of the formal and final sanction of the Marian reforms. That didn't even quite end that literally, but that had come to be because over time the Romans had gone from seasonal to probably all year round warfare. They had troops stationed abroad in hostile territories, and they had to be scattered as occupation forces. So it's obvious that from those legions, sections, segments would form kind of tactically autonomous units that were also homogeneous in that sense. And so you have what we call eventually the cohort. So with the Mongol forces, something similar happened, right? Naturally, there was an important tactical segmentation within Mongol armies, but even along that pattern, probably not that much, right? I made a video also on Mongol equipment and so on. It varied wildly over time. Also, technology as arms and armor are some of the literally least important things in warfare, like that at some point are not even relevant, if anything, because first of all, in those times material culture were pretty similar, but just people adapt to things that if they're not functional wouldn't be used. So by certain degrees it's not even a problem. We have seen in that video about the Western sources on the causes of Mongol success that the Western knights were deeply impressed by allegedly by the Mongol armor. That was something much more composite than the if you want even empirically, so like much more patchy and in fact put together heterogeneously than European coat of mail, but was surprisingly much better suited than their some specific roles at least, and was very resistant and so on. But on the longer run, it doesn't seem this to have had any particular advantage. On the contrary, we see even there that there were vulnerable spots, and that at the end of the day, Europeans wouldn't care about that type of armor anymore. They went on their own way. They just were, of course, peoples that saw each other, we can say, for the first time in that at least in that scale of interaction, and so differences were striking. But at the end of the day, what really made Mongol successes went beyond, right? It was very often even strategic before tactical in nature. Naturally, the Mongol army was constantly trained, as we've seen, to perform those maneuvers that would simplify the execution of orders. The Mongols were feared for their intimidating order and silence, right? The fact that they could move with this kind of cosmic perfection that had to embody, in fact, the divine, the divinity of the same power at just a minimal sign, right, for which all these units would march orderly and symmetrically and in a perfectly orderly way. Naturally, this wouldn't happen every single time, but at least the top Mongolian armies of the Golden Age were definitely of that quality, and were properly designed to do so. Never underestimate also the psychological effect of seeing an enemy even caring to perform certain specific maneuvers in that order, because it's just a display of power. The fact that you can afford all the training, all that synchronization, the resources, even in details, right? Even in we have a few evidence of how, for example, different units distinguished themselves, but there was, of course, within the Mongol army a sense of uniformity of some degree, like in any army in history, and it kind of reflected in part in a less individualistic and more collective way that same pride that Europeans had, for example, towards genetic, towards the eugenics, let's say. So to again see that perfection literally incarnating in this mass armies that, telling the truth, weren't even that large as they were usually said. Like, it was a bit the stereotype of the hordes of Gog and Magog arriving, the enemy being incredibly superior in numbers. But when you actually go look studying the various Mongol campaigns and so on, you realize that often they were not just actually more or less the same size of their enemies, but sometimes actually inferior in number. And this is kind of obvious because, especially on those distances and with that kind of care for properly the good enough that in warfare is dominating in general, you didn't really need to move more than enough troops, especially given those massive logistical problems that this entailed, if you can't do without, and you kind of deemed them able to do to defeat the enemy, given a specific risk calculation. Again, it was quality and that kind of load where you can't even attribute it to just pure rationale or pure discipline. It's also properly the aggressiveness of the Mongolian people for what it really was. Like, do you have the faintest idea of what it means, again, as I said at the beginning of the video, to be raised in late 12th century Mongolia? I think that your worst nightmares cannot even start to approach what a normal existence of an average person really was in that world. And that is, then for them it was normal. So ripping other people apart, frankly, wasn't something that would even bother them probably much from moral point of view. So terrorism, of course, was one of their tools, as we know, and generally speaking, that is done in warfare. A system of command and communication of orders on the battlefield, made with special flags, allowed the orders also to be immediately carried out at a signal from the commander who led the battle from an elevated position, so that it could have an optimal view of the forces if it could afford it. So when we look at this broader collective training, we realize it was definitely superior to, say, Western armies. This is obvious. Comparatively, the military professionalism of the European knight was superior to that of the average Mongolian knight. This is kind of obvious, right? The idea is that, again, the steppes troops were on average and notoriously much lighter. They were essentially horse archers, and they did count as light infantry, light cavalry, light forces in the first place. The Mongols did have infantry, of course. You cannot use any force without infantry. But of course, these were often also dismounted forces. This depends also largely on, we're talking about the first generations of Mongol expansion. So, as you know, there were also lots of other troops with them, Chinese military engineers for the artillery and so on. And more, not just that, there were lots of mobilized forces along the way, right? Local populations were terrorized and used to properly even build tracks, bridges, things like that, used as pioneers. But yes, of course, the European knight was an elite as well, and thus, if you consider also the amount of training that it counted, it was just normally older than the average, probably the average Mongolian trooper. This may be debatable, but consider that a Mongolian horseman was from between 15 to 60 years old, and that knights normally took a bit longer to kind of maximize the lifelong, much, if anything, properly omnicomprehensive training. I mean, European knight was heavy cavalry, heavy infantry, so it was trained with every single weapon, for every single military context, right? They were essentially stormtroopers. They also stormed fortifications and so on. The Mongols had instead specific units deputed to that, and generally speaking, not much of the same quality of what a pretty much more courageous knightly force in Europe could be. But again, they could afford this greater, this lower average, because what mattered was the collective training. In other words, they were able to concentrate, to deliver much greater force with less individual cost on a larger scale. It's the same example we make, not much because of technology, but because of how that technology was used in a collective fashion, doctrinally. Say, a Cherokee warrior in the 18th century would have been dramatically more skilled than a European fantassin in hand-to-hand combat, but of course European firepower and tactics in general were superior to whatever the Cherokee could field. So this is of course a bit different in the European-Mongol comparison, because still altogether Europeans were a more advanced civilization than the Mongolian one, but at the same time they were not as wild as the Mongolian. So here you have and so warlike in a broader sense. And so here you have a bit of a paradox where the wilder people manages to reach a greater military superiority in a systemic sense than the more advanced one. And this is also debatable when, of course, the Mongols especially are integrated in, say, the Chinese system, and they can essentially mobilize forces from there, and with all the, in fact, Chinese civilizational capacity. There is, in the video I made about the Karakitai, we observe also how the Mongols were not just the plainly crude nomadic people without any kind of civilizational grasp. The Mongols had been importantly influenced by China, especially, and the other. Say this is true especially for the Karakitai, but those who had mixed more with the Chinese already. That there was an important infantry dimension in Mongol armies, at least witnessed in that frontier, right? The Genghis Khan's ones were much more kind of properly nomadic, equestrian, but at the same time there was an easy way, like to integrate this system, especially in an imperial hierarchical sense, with the rulers at the top and the subjugated at the bottom, that we have seen also in other contexts. Like it's like when, I don't know, the Avars, for example, settled in the Pannonian Basin, and these were considered by the Byzantines as essentially the most military developed barbarians among all the others, including the Sasanians at the same time, which is extraordinary because Persia was indeed much more kind of a civilization compared to the others. So this shows you how, in a sense, you can top a certain aspect of civilization, such as warfare, by not being as advanced as the others. This often happens, right? It's just like the Romans were less developed civilizationally than the Greeks, but took them over because we're militarily superior to them, and so on. So it's a bit of a pattern that repeats itself with the so-called idea of the barbarian invasion, and it's kind of true. Except, as you know, everything gets down to a hybrid eventually that most of the times reaches also the highest civilizational achievements, because it kind of brings in the best of the two. And this is surely also what is true for the Mongols after they were Sinicized, for example, and they definitely reached the top of their expansion, their success, and so on. So there is a lot to discuss regarding them, which is worth considering, but I think this aspect of the Mongols having essentially topped the synchronization of these principles of the art of war in before very recent times in military history, I think is quite fascinating, and it can be profitably also compared with other cultures, military cultures such as, I don't know, the same Chinese one, the same Roman one, that achieved extraordinary standards, right? But perhaps not by managing to balance all these principles together. But again, for example, the Romans and the Chinese lasted longer, right? The Hans specifically. And so, yes, they may have not kind of fully developed all of these together by the measure the Mongols did, but surely they were doing something else next to it that were just suited to their context, their condition. So, of course, war is just an instrument of politics. Always remember that you don't need to overly invest in military resources if properly there is not a point in doing so, right, or a necessity, and you can't just obtain what you want in other ways, right? So that is also to be considered, but there is also a time in which and how the Western Europeans discovered the hard way in the early 13th centuries that, you know, civilizational developments can meet also with critical moments in which you meet, say, a military culture such as the Mongol one, coming literally out of nowhere all of a sudden, and at that point not being able, let's say, to explain it, right? Maybe you are actually already superior, and that's why, you know, European civilization went on, and the Mongol one kind of remained the one it was until, say, I don't know, the Russians took it over, they modernized it and so on. But civilization and military development are not always directly proportional to each other, because the military instrument must be developed in the first place, so you can be very resilient and resistant to have even the resources to develop your military instrument in times of need. But at the same time, there is also an optimum that hardly any civilization develops in time. And so when you look at these essentially primitive peoples, like, I don't know, the Mongols, that manage from a moment to another to expand, is you see there a goal that, for especially the relative terms of these peoples, is nothing short but extraordinary. And that's how definitely Mongol warfare should be seen and conceived, in spite of the fact, again, that the Mongol Empire ended and just a massive legacy of it survived, but not quite in the way that more permanent, say, civilization had left their mark. in the world. And this is also that significant, because whenever you see this accomplishment, you have to be, again, honest sometimes about the also, in fact, the limits of these cultures that we try not to consider whenever we see that there is somebody succeeding, but it is actually also the case. And so that finding that system that, as I was saying in the beginning, manages eventually to convince of its own worthiness the people who are called in a way or another to support it, is an important indicator that and balance that is actually very difficult to see in history, right? And that's why there are some people's cultures that can say they nailed it, but others that, in spite of some exploit, also doesn't matter how extraordinary, were spent into that. And I think this is the same case of the Mongols in a sense, but this also makes you reflect on the boundaries that exist within properly human communities and how they form, they disgregate, and so on. So this is a forever ongoing process and must be very carefully analyzed, because we tend to rely too much, in fact, on what we have rather than what we can have in a broader cognitive sense, right? We just feed on that kind of illusion at the end of the day, that things are always going to, it's the end of history illusion, by the way, that things are going to always remain somewhat the same. And instead, I think warfare develops further than any other activity that kind of awareness between action and thought and the consequences of their, in fact, interaction than any other. So having a military culture also means to have much more than that. It means to have a civilization from your side, or at least a potential and a capacity to build on it, if you have enough determination. In any case, for today, I stop it here. We'll keep talking about Mongol warfare. I just hoped that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.